Welcome to the Football Autobiography Show. I am your host, Josh Schneider-Weiler, and it is such a pleasure to be with you all today. As many of you know, in this podcast, we have people in the football industry, players, coaches, CEOs, agents, and more, reflect on their careers. Today, our guest is current Portsmouth ambassador, Alan Knight. Previously, Knight was a goalkeeper for Portsmouth from 1977 to 2000, where he made 801 appearances for the club. That's right, 801 appearances across 4 decades. Second all-time behind Jimmy Dickinson. He also made 2 appearances for the England U21 national team. He is also largely a one-club man, as he only played for one other club, and that's Havant and Waterlooville, where he played 3 matches. He has also been a goalkeeping coach for numerous clubs, including FC Dallas and Bournemouth. In this episode, Knight discusses the pros and cons of being a one-club man, making his debut as a 16-year-old, what it's like to be a goalie after a huge gaffe, playing an entire half with a concussion, and the effects of around 50 concussions on his career and life. So, without further ado, enjoy my episode with Alan Knight. So, I'm here at Portsmouth Football Club in the headquarters at Fratton Park with Alan Knight. How you doing today, Alan?
I'm good, Josh. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming doing this. So before we get into your career at Portsmouth, what's something that if people looked on your Wikipedia page, they wouldn't find? Something interesting that people maybe don't know about you?
Wow. Oh. Don't know about interesting. I think, well, as a kid, maybe I used to have trials for volleyball and basketball for national levels at different age groups. Going on, I suppose I've been pretty boring. Everything was football orientated and everything was focused in and around football. That was it. That was my life.
Did volleyball or like basketball did any of those skills carry over into your football career?
In a little bit of a way, yeah. I think the basketball side of it was good for hand and eye coordination, obviously. Same with volleyball in a way. Volleyball was good for reflexes when trying to defend people digging the ball and what have you. So in that respect, I suppose it all followed on to being a goalkeeper, yeah.
And so a lot of kids, dream or want to play in the outfield. What drew you into playing goalie?
It'll go back to when I was in junior school. How old would I have been now? About 8 or something, maybe a bit younger. And they had to pick teams to play in schools games. So we were all lined up, and I think because I was tallest, they decided to put me in goal. We had a game and a few balls hit me, more luck than judgment, and then it sort of carried on from there. And I think just as a kid, I used to watch it on the telly, on the TV. Back then, goalkeepers of the time would have been Gordon Banks rolling into sort of Ray Clements and Peter Shilton, and they become sort of like my role model. So that's who I sort of emulated and used to like diving around getting muddy, so that was how it all started, really.
And when you were younger, what were your dreams?
My dreams was to become a professional footballer, become a goalkeeper. I think like all kids, you want to become a footballer. I wanted to play for my country, and be the best I possibly could at my profession. Yeah, that's always what it was, and maybe wrongly or rightly, may become a bit obsessed with that in the end, but that's the way in them days you were trained, drilled to try and achieve to become the best at what you were doing.
And so when you finally were making your first debut for the team, first professional debut in your senior team, I believe you were 16.
Yeah.
What was that like? What were you feeling? What was that day like? Take me there.
Well, I mean, it's one of the few days I won't forget, I must admit, because it is special to be picked at a young age as well. And And yeah, I mean, the nerves, the pride, everything that goes around it. My parents coming to watch me up at Rotherham to get through the game and get a clean sheet as well, and to win the game because we were already relegated. I don't think we had won an away game that season. I mean, obviously looking back on it now, you think, okay, Rotherham probably had the flip-flops on. We're thinking of their summer holidays last game. They had nothing to play for. Yeah, so if I could really sort of like put it under the microscope, I'd probably do myself down a little bit. But no, fantastic occasion. I didn't have a great deal to do. We seemed to step it up. I think the lads, the senior players at the time, actually played a little bit harder to try and cover me because they knew I was a kid. And as I say, no, great experience to get that win and a clean sheet. The then kit man at the time, Gordon Neave, brought me back down to earth very quickly afterwards. Didn't allow you to get any too big for me boots. He had me picking up the kit and pushing the skips back onto the coach, ready to go for the long trip home.
And how did your expectations meet the reality?
Well, it's funny because obviously as a youngster then, that give you a taste, and then I had to wait quite a while to really, I say quite a while, a couple of years before I could get a long run in the side, get it to make number one spot my own. And those 2 years it was quite frustrating. I was in and out the side. It had made me a little bit obsessed to try and get in the side. I was battling to get into the team with Peter Miller, who was first team keeper at the time. He had come in not long after I'd made my debut. Peter had played for Fulham, Burnley, Hereford, and was a well-established senior experienced goalkeeper. So it took me a little bit of a while to dislodge him. And then by the time that second real chance come along, I took it. I can look back and say that I took it with both hands because I think I more or less stayed in the side for more than 15 odd years. I was sort of like a never present.
And you're talking about trying to dislodge him from the team. What were your preparations like at the time? What type of coaching were you getting in those? You know, we're talking the late 70s.
You didn't. There was no goalkeeping coaching. You didn't have any. I learned off Peter. I'd watch him in matches, and in training, we'd warm up, kick a few balls to each other. But the idea was we joined in with the outfield players. We did whatever the outfield players, and at the end we'd have a small-sided game. So you'd be playing in them, and then maybe at the end of that you'd have a bit of shooting. So any real coaching never really happened for me, not till coming towards the end of my career. Frank Burrows early on did a couple of sessions with me, but Frank was a centre-half. He was manager at the time, but he was an ex-centre-half, and he didn't really know too great detail about.
So at what point did you start getting that kind of specialist training as a goalie? Are we talking like in the 80s, 90s?
Mike Kelly come in when Bobby Campbell was manager, so that would have been late 80s.
Okay.
And to be honest, didn't probably get on with Mike tremendously well. We had a bit of a... But I've met him since then, and everything fine. But I mean, at that time, I think... Yeah, we had a bit of a clash of personalities. I'd been in the side a long time, and I felt I hadn't really had a goalkeeping coach. He'd come in with his ideas, and I felt he was trying to change the way I played, and I just wasn't basically having that. I thought I'd done it for 10 years or whatever it is by the time he turned up. And
was it like more techniques or like...
Yeah, he'd added drills, and he tried to change my actual way I played. But looking back on it, there was a couple of things that he did actually go through that I thought weren't...
Can you give him any example?
That was just about using an area within your 6-yard box and not being dragged out past your near post and being dragged into situations you don't need to. You stay and rely on your reflexes. And I thought that... Looking back on that, I thought that was a decent little bit that added to my game. But at the time, obviously, I thought I knew better, and I'd become a little bit obstinate, and no one really had... That was just as goalkeeping coaches had sort of like evolved.
Because I read that one of the first learning experiences you had was from Peter Shilton. That Alan Ball kind of showed you some of the work Peter Shilton had done. And I want to read a quote. He said, quote, "It's hard work indeed, but 2 or 3 times a week, it's all we had to do, and I'm certainly feeling better for it. I'm trying to be more positive and get out to crosses better. Perhaps it's got something to do with the other lads calling me Flapper." So this is a quote you said. And so what is something that Peter Shilton taught you, through Alan Ball?
Well, obviously, Bally would have watched Shilts train when he was at Southampton. And, there was always the thing. I mean, we've all got our strengths and weaknesses, and I was always called Dracula because of crosses, coming and catching crosses, and as they Flapper or whatever. Having said that, though, I don't think Shilts was probably that great at it himself, but I know, obviously, I made that quote, and I do actually remember that. I'm quite surprised he managed to dig that up. That's very good that you managed to find that. But yeah, so Bally brought with him, as I say, you didn't have a Pacific goalkeeping coach, and that's even with Bally all those years later, that he come in and he didn't, unlike Mike, he just said, well, this is what I remember watching Shilts do. So again, I took on board what I felt was useful to whatever I thought I needed at the time, yeah.
Yeah, in your autobiography, you also talk about an experience where you met Peter Schmeichel after a game against Manchester United, out in a club, and you just kind of were, just trading goalkeeping tactics and, views and ideas. And I'm curious, because you didn't really have any specialist goalkeeper training until the late 80s. How much did you have to just learn from your peers, and was there almost like a fraternity of goalkeepers in the English leagues at that time because of that lack of coaching?
It didn't. I think back then, it's not like it is now. There is a fraternity, as you say, and there's if you work together, I think there's always that camaraderie, but there's also that you are fighting for each other's place, especially for one position. And now there is more of a goalkeeping union as such. It was building as I was going and coming through my career, but even more so there is that, as I say, the goalkeeping union as such, especially where you now have these sub-goalkeepers. The whole dynamic of goalkeeping has changed over recent times, I think. But going back to meeting Peter, I mean, we had Benny Christensen, Danish lad that was playing for us. We'd gone up there and played them. I think we drew 3-3. And then, as I say, after the game, we all went out, had a drink, met in a club, ended up talking to Peter, was introduced by Benny Christensen. Sat there, had a few beers, smoked a few cigarettes, and just went over all sorts of things. But it's funny you should say about Peter, because I think Peter did change goalkeeping in this country, definitely. The way he played, the spider that he used to come out where he would spread himself. His son actually does it now, very similar with Leicester. Which did, and the way that he played, I think he was probably the best keeper of his generation. And as I say, he changed the whole dynamic of goalkeeping. And
how so? Besides the coming out really big on like breakaways and
I think because you've got to be able to time that. Not all keepers can do what he did, and I think we've seen keepers did come flying out and bringing players down all over the place. You've got to be able to time that technique and that skill. But I think his all-round dominance of the area and his back four, I think, was something that keepers growing up at that time took on board, and yeah, I do believe that changed the whole dynamic of goalkeeping.
Well, you were a goalkeeper coach for a while. Mm-hmm. What were the most common mistakes that you saw young keepers make?
I don't know if there's common mistakes. I think the mistake we're making now, and now I'm going into a territory, obviously I've not been a goalkeeping coach for 4 years or so, but I do feel we are losing our identity with the way we coach our keepers. I think keepers are not allowed to express themselves. And I feel like outfield players are a little bit the same. I think they want them to be robots. They're all pigeonholed. We're all different. I was different to keepers that I grew up with. I mean, you look back to the ones that I go back to, like Shilton, Clements. You had Joe Corrigan at the time. You had Cooper at Ipswich, a small guy. These guys were all physiologically different. You can't train doing the same thing for each person. You've got to, as a coach, I think you should have a training program for each individual, not just your basic generic training, dance over a few cones, have the ball kicked at you. It's got to be more than that. And I just find that the whole coaching and training of keepers and outfield players to a certain extent has become boring, bland and robotic.
Now, you mentioned earlier in your career, obviously there were no goalkeeping coaches. Mm-hmm. And then, towards the end in the late 90s, you had a lot of specialist time where you worked with the goal. You had, private sessions away from, the outfield players. Mm-hmm. Did you ever sense later in your career that being a goalkeeper could be kind of a lonely job?
Goalkeeping always has been, always will be. They say you've got to be mad to be a goalkeeper, and goalkeepers are different to any other position on that field. None more so than obviously when you make that mistake and you become the loneliest man in the stadium when you've made that cock up. And now, 17 years since I played my last game, people only really remember your cock-ups, your mistakes. And I will always be, till my grave, reminded of a mistake with Noel Blake at Wimbledon with the back pass. So that one will live with me forever. No one remembers the saves. And the problem is, you get as well, everything on YouTube is Pompey more or less conceding a goal. So every goal we conceded, it don't look great as a keeper, does it? But that's the way it is. And I mean, the 99.9% of everyone is good about it. It's all a jovial banter about it. But that is the one thing I think, not just me, it'll be any goalkeeper. Most of the stuff that will be out there will be your cock-ups. But that's a goalkeeper's lot. I'm not moaning about that. It's just the way it was.
So, I mean, since you mentioned the Noel Blake back pass that led to the own goal, mm-hmm. And you were injured at the time, when that type of thing happens, you say you could be the loneliest man in the world at the time. How do you kind of get over that hurdle?
I think people talk about inner belief and your confidence, and that's a big thing. But it's not just for goalkeepers as well. It is huge for goalkeepers, the confidence side of it. But it's about trying to keep that confidence and belief that would be a one-off. I think because it was such a freak goal, and then didn't expect that to happen week in, week out.
And so when you mentioned fans only remember the cock-ups, and especially outfield players, they make a mistake, and a minute later they're back on the ball. Yeah, but you have all, it could be 5 minutes, could be 10 minutes before you even see action again. What inner dialogue is happening at that moment?
Well, you're thinking of more or less how did I manage to do that? Why did I do that? And you'll be thinking of how do I explain that later.
To your coach?
Well, to your coach, to anyone that's going to speak to you or whatever. First off, you've got to try and explain it to yourself. And sometimes you just got to go, I've had a mare. I can't. It happens. You have bad days. You had these things happen. You've got to try that because the ball is going to come back at some stage. You've got to be positive. It's difficult because you do start to think, next one comes in. If I mess this up, I'm going to look a fool. But that's what it was all about. It's great when things are going well and you're making saves here, there, and everyone's. But that, I say that was all part of the joy.
You had before we came on, we were talking, and you mentioned the game against Liverpool in the 1992 FA Cup semi-final. Can you kind of take me through, because that's probably one of the most famous games you played in. Can you talk me through what the nerves were like, what the build-up was like before that game?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we got to the semi-final of the FA Cup to play Liverpool at Highbury. We'd had a decent run through. We'd beaten Middlesbrough, Notts Forest on our way through, and no one really gave us a hope. We'd gone and we were staying out up near Luton somewhere prior to it. We'd gone up on the Thursday, I think it was, and we were Jim Smith, the manager at the time, along with Brooke Baddow and Neil Sillett. I don't think he'd really picked his team. He wasn't too sure he was going to play centre-half, Gavin Maguire, whether we were going to go 3 at the back, 4 at the back. So the idea was to sit deep and take the pressure. I mean, it's a common thing now, but at the time it was quite a coaching first, really. But we were going to sit deep and then try and hit them on the break. We had Mark Chamberlain and we had obviously Darren Anderton, Guy Whittingham, both with pace up front. So it had worked really, really well. And we'd nicked a lead in extra time. Oh, but sorry, I've gone on a little bit quicker. I mean, yeah, the build-up prior to that, I mean, obviously turning up, there was a sea of blue and white. There was a bit of red and white here and there, but it just seemed to us to be covered in Portsmouth supporters just going up to Highbury once we went out. And the nerves were there. No, I mean, you get those games, those special games where your nerves and you are worried yourself. You can't allow that to affect you when you're playing. You do get a little bit worried that you may freeze out there, but let's say once that whistle goes, everything then is directed, and you want to get that first touch of a ball, and then you forget what else is going on around you. I've got to be honest, I wasn't particularly busy in either game. I've got to be honest, I didn't have a great deal to do. As I say, obviously we took the lead. We 0-0 at full time, went into extra time. Darren Anderton scored by past Bruce Grobbelaar, broke away, like I said. I mean, the big thing for me was the fact that we lost Mark Chamberlain. In that Ronnie Whelan, who ended up scoring the goal, should have been sent off, or would have been sent off these days. But as I say, we were 1-0 up, and then there was 3 minutes left. We give a free kick away. John Barnes takes a free kick. There's also this debate that I should have had a stronger wrist, but I saved the ball into the post. Unfortunately, the ball rolled back across the goal line. Ronnie Whelan runs up, taps into an empty net. So that was bitterly disappointing, but there was a lot of pride about the fact that we'd held the mighty Liverpool to a draw and should have probably beat them, if I'm being perfectly honest. And then obviously there was the replay to contend a couple of weeks later, and it was going to be the first time penalties because there was a general election and they couldn't afford another replay. So we played that game, obviously 0-0 at full time, 0-0 at the end of extra time. A game that we possibly had the better chances and could have nicked it. But unfortunately, the experience of the Liverpool lads, with obviously all their European experience and penalty shootouts, I think first time we'd ever experienced that, and then a couple of the lads missed their penalties. I think I only faced 3 penalties, and I didn't dive the right way in any of them. I always joke that I would have saved the other 2 if given the opportunity, but no, I mean, very, very disappointing, because I do feel if we'd gone through, we would have beaten Sunderland. I know it's all ifs, buts and maybes, but I'm pretty certain we would have. But as it wasn't meant to be. Fantastic experience, even in defeat. Got to give Liverpool their due. They were very professional, magnanimous. I think we were a little bit worried because of obviously after Brucey's, and I know Bruce and I get on really well with Brucey Grobbelaar, there was this would he be disrespectful and do the wobbly leg bit in the penalty shootout like he did in the European Cup final? To give him his due, he didn't. He was totally respectful to our lads, and he didn't need to do that anyway because the lads had wobbly legs taking them. But but yeah, I know. But they were very magnanimous, and they were terrific at the end. Give us swap their shirts round and give us mementos. And as I say, that's a bittersweet memory. Yeah, definitely.
And at the time, as you mentioned, most of the games were resolved by replay, and obviously there weren't really penalty shootouts back then in England. What type of penalty how did people practice penalties in the past? Did they?
Well, as I say, it was sort of like a newish thing coming in, and there's always been this thing about English, we're crap at taking penalties, which historically I suppose that's right. I mean, we did do a little bit of, well, say, how do you practice a penalty? I mean, some lads...
Yeah, I should have... I meant
No,
how
I know what you're saying, because it is, you just have a little competition between yourselves, or we did at the time. I don't know if that's changed now. You got lads that are confident taking them. But I think the big thing was we did have a list of a few that would take them, but when it come to it, they didn't want to do it. And I'm not going to say names because I don't think that's fair, but at the time some people say they bottled it, but they just didn't feel confident. So I understand that. It's no good saying I'm going to take it and you're not confident when someone else would have done. And some other people would probably give them stick and say they'd bottled it. But as I say, it happened that one or two didn't fancy taking the penalty, and the ones that did take the penalties that I wouldn't have thought would have actually scored. So that Kit Simons took one, scored. I didn't think Kit would, but he stood up and took it, and he actually scored.
You were signed as an apprentice by Jimmy Dickinson.
Mm-hmm. Jimmy all round here. Yeah.
You guys can't see at home, but you know the walls here are just covered with Portsmouth legends. Like Jimmy Dickinson. And what was it like first being signed by him as an apprentice? I mean, a legend even at the time, and then. Who are some other coaches that you admired or really appreciated while you were at Portsmouth? Yeah,
well, I mean, obviously Jimmy had stepped up. Jimmy is a legend at this club. Real gentleman Jim, they called him, and he was a gentleman. He was secretary of the football club. The club at that time, same old story with poor old Pompey, were struggling financially and slipping down the leagues. We, as they were relegated into Division 4, which is Division 2 now. League 2, and Jimmy has stepped into the breach and taken over the manager's job, originally with Ray Crawford, who was my youth team coach at the time, because I'd come here at 14. When it came to being signed at 16 as an apprentice, West Ham had come in to sign me, and Ron Greenwood at the time come down, met with Jimmy. They had offered some money for me, another player.
And that was your childhood team growing up?
Yeah, well, obviously from London, I was a West Ham supporter. And I had been to meet Ron Greenwood, John Lyle, with my dad during that season, and they had offered me a deal. I mean, this is naughty and I shouldn't have done it. But they offered me a deal, which was a year as an apprentice, a year professional. And all I had said at the time, and because I'd been here at Pompey from 14 as a kid on weekends, school holidays, playing in the youth team, I'd met all my mates were going to be apprentices. They were my mates that I was playing with. And I tried to explain this to Greenwood and Lyle, and I said, well, I'm not going to just walk out on Pompey. I said, I don't think Pompey would let me anyway. And then they said, well, refuse to clean the boots and this. And I thought, well, back then, there's no way you could have done that. I went, well, that wasn't what I was about. I said, if Pompey were prepared to let me go, and they didn't want me, or you were going to give them money, because I know they're skint, and I know they probably could do with a few quid, then my conscience would be clear on that side of it, and then everyone's happy. So, as I say, Ron Green was supposed to come down close season. I think offered around about 30 or 40 grand for me, another player. I think it was about £40,000 back then, and Greeny. I think it was Greeny, plus a player. And I think Jimmy had actually accepted the deal, and this supposedly got back to Ray, who lived around the corner, Ray Crawford, who was his assistant and was my youth team mate. He'd stepped up, and he had heard this. He was painting his ceiling or something, and he came rushing round in his work gear, covered in paint, and told Jimmy not to sell me, allegedly. So Pompey turned it down, and the rest is. Literally, the rest is history. I stayed, and unfortunately, not too long after that, Jimmy passed away. And so, lovely man. Possibly, without being too controversial, I think that the pressure of being the manager, the club probably ended up killing poor old Jim. I've got to be honest, and I don't think it was something he really wanted. His family may tell different. I think it was an undue pressure the club put on him for a club that he loved and adored. But as I say, and obviously Ray Crawford, Ray stepped down, Frank Burrows come in between that time, and it gave me my debut with Jimmy, prior to obviously Jimmy passing away. So Frank had a big bearing on my career. I still see Frank occasionally now, and we talk about the past, and now it seemed every season I used to put in a transfer request because I got frustrated, as I said earlier, that I wasn't in the team. And then, managers from then that had a big bearing on me. Obviously, Frank, first time round. We sort of fell out a little bit the second time he come back. Bobby Campbell. Bobby Campbell was a big part of it, although, again, there was a few things that we didn't go on. One was Mike Kelly, although Mike didn't stay long, and he went off to West Brom. But Bobby did fantastic for this club when we won the third division, and he brought in players like Neil Webb, Alan Biley, Mark Haitley. So Bobby was a big influence. Then obviously Alan Ball had 3 great years with Baldy. He put together my favourite team at the time, which would include Blakey, Billy, Mickey Kennedy, Vince, Kelly, Kevin Dillon. All that group was a joy to play in, and to finally get promoted into the old First Division, which is now the Premier League, was great. Unfortunately, it was only for 1 year. The club at the time was focusing on basketball, or the chairman was, Mr. Deacon, and he was looking to sell the club at the time, so we never bought or invested in staying in there. But obviously there wasn't the money that Premiership has now. That's just the way it was. And after that, Jim Smith, when he came in, brought all the young lads in, the Andertons, the Alfords, the Kit Simons, and that side of it, I was then the senior player. But obviously we had the cup run, we had the playoffs that we just missed out on after a fantastic run. That was very frustrating, that one. But as I say, but Jim was a fantastic manager as well. So they're the ones that I really look to. Obviously, once I finished playing, I've got to say, you've got to look at what Harry did here. The 2 times. I wasn't here the second time he come back, but the first time round when he put the team of Merson, Deseu, and all those sort of players that he managed to get us out of the Championship. That was a fantastic bunch of lads. Stevie Stone. The list goes on, and I've gone a little bit blank on naming those boys, but they were fantastic. Shaka Eslop in goal, and so I was goalkeeping coach at the time, and they were an absolute joy to watch. And
to go all the way back to the beginning, you were talking about how it was agreed that you would be going to West Ham. I mean, you were at this point been with Pompey for essentially 40 years. How often do you think of that? It was just, it was really close to all of this not be your whole life being completely different?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. Look, the issues about West Ham, and I don't sit there and think what if, because at that time they had a young goalkeeper called Mervyn Day, who was going to be the next big thing for England. I know Mervyn moved on, then Phil Parkes come in. So I think I may have really struggled to have broken to the side. I probably wouldn't have broken. So I would have probably been on the heap or going around doing other stuff, and who's to know what would have happened then. So I don't regret that in one shape or form. And these things happen, and they happen for a reason in football. And all I wanted to do was play football. That's all I ever wanted to do. In them days, obviously, the money wasn't particularly in there. Well, no way like what it is now. We did have contractual issues. We didn't have freedom of contract back then. And then you would have been promised things and people would go back on certain promises, normal stuff. But the be-all and end-all was just to be playing. And the only time I wasn't happy was when I wasn't playing and if I'd lost my place. And thankfully that wasn't that often.
You mentioned things were promised, and what, just for example, for someone who didn't grow up in that time or playing in that time, what's an example? What's something that might be promised that might have been taken back or reneged on?
Well, I'll go back to the time when Bawley was manager, and we missed out a couple of times right at the death on the end of the season on automatic promotion. There wasn't playoffs then either. And I think only 2 went up. And we'd missed out more or less on the last day 2 times on the bounce. And normally contracts, as I say, you didn't have freedom of contract then. But contracts would be sort of start to negotiate if the club wanted to keep you just into the new year. So you go and have a pre-chat. I had a chat with the chairman then, Mr. Deacon. I can't remember the exact figures, but let's just say you were talking about it and you said, well, yeah, I'll sign a 2-year and your wages will go up. £100 a week. Go, yeah, shake hands, that's great. We got to the end of the season, we missed out, didn't get promoted, and then the offer had come back and it would be a £20 a week rise. They'd gone back, so you'd say, you didn't offer me that, and then they'd go, have you got anything in writing? And you'd go, no. So you were shafted, basically, if I can say that, and you had to get on with it. And all you could do was put in a transfer request, and then I'll go on the transfer list all through the summer, and then it'll get to the start of the season, Bawley would go to me, look, Knights, if you don't come off the transfer list, I can't play you. The chairman won't have it. So then I'd withdraw my transfer request, and then I've wasted my time. It's just been a complete waste of time. But that happened 2 years on the bounce, and I don't think I even got that rise. By then I'd signed a contract, so I never even got offered a new one when we got promoted. So, yeah, I missed out on both.
Since it's so rare these days to have one club, players, a player who plays at a club for their entire career, like Steven Gerrard, in your case, you. What are some of the pros and cons of being a one-club man?
See, it was more common back then because of freedom of contract. Players would stay at a club, they try and sign long contracts as possible because there was that security in that. And the club owned the player. That was the way it is. Obviously, once freedom of contract, the players are the bosses now. Players have that power over clubs. And as you say, you've got Gerrard, you've got Giggs, you've got the big Uber clubs now that will have the odd player that will stay for a bit of longevity. That is dying away, obviously, with Giggs and Gerrard now falling away because they were brought up through the youth team. They were playing exceptional players. Now, in the lower leagues, which I spent most of my time, obviously I come up from and spent most of my career, well, all my career really, in the Championship. I was a Championship keeper. I think I was an average or a decent Championship keeper. That's my level. I get that. I accept that. But now, because of the freedom of contract side of it, it's great if you're a Championship stroke Premiership Uber player because you can go off, and you can see what's going on. You see it week in, week out, year in, year out, off chasing the money. Their agents are working very hard for those guys to move them on. Even once they've signed a contract or gone to a club, their agent's looking for the next one. The flip of that doesn't work too well for, with no disrespect, little Billy Smith playing for Exeter City, who's probably on £300 a week, and he's scrimping and saving, trying to earn a living, and freedom of contract doesn't help him because he'll probably be offered a 1-year contract, year in, year out, hoping to get, and you end up going round on the mill. If you look at Div 1 and the the conference, very similar. It's Div 2 and the conference. It regurgitates all the same players. It seems to me they're all. You look in Div 2 now, probably all that lot were playing at different clubs, but they've all been sort of like moved around or dropped down from a level above. So there's no. So the cons in it for me now for those lads that are trying to earn a living is that there's no stability for them. They will be journeymen and moving around trying to earn a living. So I don't think freedom of contracts particularly help that the lower level player. And I don't mean that with no disrespect because we've all got our levels. And as I say, for the boys that are at the higher point, then the world is their oyster and they're going to be multi-millionaires.
But for someone like you, what if you were talking to a young player that was considering, saying a young player at Portsmouth that was thinking of, I want to play my whole career here, but I have the possibility of maybe moving elsewhere. If you were trying to sell them on staying their whole career at a club,
that is a massively difficult one.
What would you tell them?
That is
as someone who's done it.
It's what I actually do say to the kids. I do say to them, look, you've got to weigh up, more or less what I said earlier, you've got to weigh up what do you actually want yourself. Do you just want the money? Are you playing for just the money? Which, again, I understand and I get. People have got to look after their futures. Or do you love the game enough just to want to play week in, week out, earn good money, don't get me wrong, earn a decent dough doing that. Or do you just want to chase the money? And then that's something they have to make a decision on. And you play on... I'm not playing on their conscience, I'm playing on their desire to be a footballer. And that's what, for me, it is all about. And I think I would say to them, you've got where Pompey are at the moment, and it was at the time I broke into the side, you've got more chance of breaking into the first team here where we are at the moment. Once teams hit into the Championship and the Premiership, your opportunities of playing at that level are almost zero. But where we are at the moment, you've got more chance of breaking into the first team. And once you're in the first team, and if you're good enough, then teams, the bigger clubs, will come get you. If we're not to move on into the Championship / Premiership at some stage, you'll be gobbled up, you'll be taken, and money will come your way.
I want to talk about a really important issue with you that you spoke about a couple of years ago. So just bear with me while I get just some information out for the audience who might not know a lot about it. The issue of brain injuries in football is quite expansive, but it kind of came to light after British player Jeff Assel in 2002 died, and the Jeff Assel Foundation found that over 250 former players suffered from some sort of neurodegenerative disease. And just this year, there was a study that came out where 4 players were diagnosed with CTE, which is normally associated with rugby, or more even commonly known as from American football. So that makes it like 8 players in history where it's been recorded. And even in those 4 in the studies this year, none of the players had any serious concussions confirmed in their careers, at least. And you said in a recent article, in a couple of years ago in the Portsmouth paper, The News, that you had 10 concussions or more in your career, and quote, "I suffered some pretty traumatic head injuries in the time I played, and I believe I have a degree of brain damage. I have a poor memory. My short-term and long-term memory is awful. Sometimes I'm getting halfway through a conversation and then cannot remember what I was talking about. There's also a number of matches I can never recall. I question that." So that's all, just a little context for my first question, which is, tell me about your first concussion or serious head injury.
Right, my first serious one would have been, and it was serious as well, was when I was 15. I was playing for inner London schools. I think we were playing up at, Lanarkshire. They'd come down, it doesn't matter who we were playing, but basically I'd come out, that's probably why I was rubbish at crosses. I'd come out for a cross and I got a smack on the back of the head, was out, got back up, couldn't stand up, was wobbly, so they took me off, was given the normal, if you feel sick or anything and are sick, go to the hospital. So we played out in North London. I lived in South London. My dad was driving me back and I started to be violently sick. So the nearest one, I think, was St Bartholomew's Hospital. Well, that's where I ended up. And so I was 15, rushed into there, in and out of consciousness. My brain was swelling. They were on about having to drill in to relieve the pressure, and I was in hospital for 3 days with that concussion, or severe brain injury, really, basically. And I wasn't allowed to play for about 3 or 4 months after that. Suffered with all sorts going on from there. So that was my first real bad one. Then when I become a pro, I would say with training, because everything from training to match days, everything was played at high intensity. We trained as hard as we played matches. There'd be tackles flying in, so you'd be diving in at people's feet. There was a lot more. That doesn't happen quite so much in the game now for goalkeepers, but diving at people's feet, especially in the small-sided games. So I would say I was getting 2-3 concussions a season over that 25-year period. So it's probably more than 10. And Wimbledon, my favourite place. I had my cheekbone, nose broken, eye socket shattered from an elbow from Eric Young. I was out for 4 months with that. That was a serious trauma to my brain as well. And it is true, I will get through a conversation, be having conversations with people, and then I'll forget what the first bit was I was on about. And as I say, we've spoken about, I have actually remembered a few things you've brought up here, but there are games when I'm doing the radio for the club, and the lads that I do it with will bring up certain games that I played in. I can't remember actually playing in that game. Like it never ever happened.
It is kind of twofold, but did it scare you after the first time you got a concussion and you were out for 3 months? Did that scare you? And
no.
Does it, no?
No, not at all. Just wanted to get back out and play again.
Does it scare you now that you've lost?
Because you're so
fixated
chunks? In playing. It's like when I said I had my cheekbone smashed against Wimbledon, and it was coming towards the end of the season. It was a year we got relegated from the old First Division Premiership as it is now. Bawley was manager. It was about just before we had been relegated, but I obviously missed the rest of the season. I come back to start the next season, and Bawley, and I agreed with it. I know I must have at the time. I think now what was I doing? But Bawley was putting balls into areas where I had to go and dive at people's feet because he had to see if I'd lost me bottle. Basically, was it going to affect me? Was I going to be too scared to go at people's feet? But I can honestly say I hadn't. I had no qualms about diving at people's feet. Felt the face was fine, but. Yeah, as you say, looking back at it now, you think, geez, why put yourself at that risk?
You played a game at Doncaster in the early 80s, and you played the entire second half with a concussion. I'm sure, based on what you're telling me right now, that wasn't the only time that you played a half, or I don't know how long. With
I
concussion.
I don't think that's anything too uncommon. I mean, we've seen fairly recently players and goalkeepers that have stayed on. I know that is changing now, and rightly so. But you feel you can't come, especially then. We didn't have a sub goalkeeper, and you think you got to stay on rather than put your full back or your centre half in goal and be a man down. I mean, I had issues. I broke my hand once up at Sheffield, and I tried to stay on with that. And when I finally come off, because I couldn't, my knuckle was bust, and I was just making a fool of myself, and the team were better off with someone else in goal. But the manager at the time, sorry about my terminology, his exact words were, he called me a puff. And I'm looking at him and thinking, I've got a broken hand. And you're trying to demean me that I've come off and make me feel bad that I've let everyone down. So that's the mentality that you had at that time. That's on a broken hand. So, yeah, you had to stay on. That was it. You just had no choice. And to be honest, didn't want to come off. Felt I was letting people down if I did.
And how did that change as you got maybe to the mid to late 90s? Did the culture or mentality change?
The mentality
at all?
started to change, but a lot of it comes from American football. A lot of stuff that comes back over has been because it gets more scrutinised over there, and they start to look at those things, like you say. And look, there's lads, you're talking about Jeff Astle, those boys of that era, heading those laced leather footballs that must have weighed, when they were wet, they're deadly weapons, what they were made to head. And I think there's a lot more if it's looked at, not just at professional level, it would be at amateur level and below. Even the lads that must have played at weekends, because a lot of lads used to play at the weekends, heading those balls was cause all sorts of damage to people's brains.
Well, I know in the youth in America, I believe under the age of 10, I don't think you're allowed to head a ball anymore in practice.
No, I know they bring that, and I don't disagree with that. The balls are a lot lighter now, but it still isn't right. Don't get me wrong. And that's the thing that sort of annoys me now. We've got the thing about head injury, and referees are stopping games for that. And I totally get that, and I think that's right. But players have a responsibility too, with this framing of injuries, and it really winds me up when I'm commentating. I see on the that a player will feign a head injury to gain advantage, and I think referees have to clamp down on it. If there's someone down feigning a head injury just to get the game stopped, I think they should be booked or even sent off.
And when you see a player, concussed, or you watch these games. And, you say some people feign it, but, also when you see a player that gets seriously injured in the head, what are you thinking or feeling when you're watching the game?
Well, it's obviously, my worry is that these lads need to be given the best possible attention. They need to. It can't be helped. It is, but it is a. I know it's getting less and less a contact sport, but these things happen. I don't want them to be a non-contact. Far from it. But like you say, once that happens, they have to be got off the pitch and given proper medical attention to allow the brain to heal and be stopped from playing. I know it'll frustrate the hell out of them, but they must wait till they're fully fit, ready to play again.
And did you, what did the protocol when you were, treated by a doctor, the protocol, how did that change from 77 to 1999? What was the change in the protocol with the doctor? Did the doctor ask you the same questions, or?
It would be the same thing on follow your fingers, and they were obviously checking out your pupils, whether you could focus or whatever. So you was just doing the same thing, try and count. Do you remember where you are? Do you know where you are? All the normal stuff. But it was basically get up, go and get out there.
Did you sense that they were independent, or that they were looking out for players' interests?
I think they were looking at the club's interest more than the players. And I think that was probably because that was just the way it was then. That was you were first and foremost, get your backside out there. I mean, it was, you didn't come off unless you had to be carried off.
I want to switch gears. In your autobiography, you had a quote. Quote: "With hindsight, I had been selfish throughout my career in ignoring my parents and being so insular by making football the be-all and end-all of my life. That was never more apparent than in the days before my mother died, when, as a result of my pushing her out of my life, I was unaware of how ill she had been." So at what point did football kind of take over your life and become the end-all, be-all? And is that the experience that made you realize it?
Not till a little bit afterwards. I mean, obviously my mother was very, very ill. We had a conversation the night before she died, and I know she was very upset in the way that I had treated her in those months leading up to her death. And as I say, yeah, I didn't realise. I mean, that's easy for me to say. Maybe I didn't want to, and I didn't take enough time out to find out just how poorly she was and what had led up to. It's only recently that I've spoken with my sisters that it was to do with something that was going on within the family, with her sisters, my aunties, that had basically got my mother to where she is. But that's another story. But I mean, I wasn't helping the situation. I'd recently had a baby, her first grandchild. Jade would have been 3 or 4 months when my mother died. So, as I say, there's a lot of things and lots of things that hurt in and around that. And I wasn't a good person. I was a bad person. I should have done a lot more around that.
Because the reason I bring that up is it seems that might be a problem that's especially true with footballers, because it's so in line. You know, their career is so in line with their identity. And I was just wondering if you'd noticed that sort of identity problem with others.
Yeah, I mean, I know you've gone back onto my autobiography, which went up to a certain period. Since then, there's still a lot more has gone on. I mean, there's been my battle with alcohol, being in rehab, and where I've got to since then. That side of it, and again, I don't want to use it as an excuse, but running alongside my playing career in a culture, a drink culture within football at the time, where we all played together, we worked together, we drank together. If you didn't do all that, you weren't one of the lads. And it was, I mean, over that time, with the stuff I've gone through, I've come to realise I was a functioning alcoholic while as a player. And that compounded my selfishness, if that's the right word, and me being insular and really pushing people that love me away. And as I say, I have to live with that, and I'll always have to live with the fact that I feel I really disappointed my mother towards the end.
Yeah, it's something that in my conversation with Cyril Regis, he kind of relayed as well. In that time period in the late 70s and the 80s, it kind of echoing what you just said with that, drinking and being one of the lads, really kind of shone through.
Yeah. Well, that as I say, that was, everyone thinks, that was fantastic, and it was. Don't get me wrong, I've had some fantastic times, but you look back on it now, and you think of some of the wasted, a lot of the wasted time and a lot of the wasted relationships that have been ruined because of that, and because of I could try and wrap it up, but it's just basic selfishness.
And you played for a really long time, so you'd be best to know the answers to these questions. So what, compare 1977, your first game for Portsmouth, with last year, 2000. What was the biggest change on the field for players, whether it be goalie or for outfield players?
Goalie, obviously, the back pass rule. back pass rule, massive change. Your feet had to tidy it up. I mean, at first the idea was when it was a back pass, you just kicked it first time and booted it into the stand, and it took a while for anyone to get to grips with how the goalkeeping role would evolve around that. And I think we've seen that now, that some people want you to be basically an outfield player. And Pep's doing it, or tried to do that with Bravo last year, which was fine when you're playing for Barcelona and you don't have a shot to save. But when you're playing in the side and you're not a real goalkeeper, your passing might be, and you might be able to do a drag back and distribute the ball brilliantly with your feet. But if someone shoots, you can't save it because you're not a goalie. So yeah, back pass rule for me was a big change in that.
And off the field, what was the difference in the dressing rooms between 1997 or 1977 and 2000, excluding the money, because of course we know the money's gotten.
Yeah, we've said that. No, the thing is the influx of foreign players, and I think there was a lot of rubbish brought in, but there's been a lot of very, very, very good players brought in. And now I think all the good stuff is more or less, it's all sort of worked out. That all the good stuff that come through from having that foreign influence, the dietary stuff, the drinking, I mean, that all went out the window. And players now, and it goes back to the money, and you can't blame them, players now look after themselves a lot better than they did, because they are a commodity. Their body is their tool, and they've got to look after themselves, and that has been brought to them by the foreign players that did come into the country. And it's maybe gone a little bit too much the other way, because it is now difficult for our younger players to play at the high level. They have to be loaned out down the leagues. And early on there was a lot of poor dross that come into it, but that was how the game evolved, and I think since then there's good things and bad things that have happened with the way the game's gone for me. As I just feel it's a bit too technically overcoached and a bit too textbook, some of it, and it does get a little bit boring, and I do miss a bit of blood and thunder with the old school tackling that used to go on. But that again, it's got to be, you can't just be kicking people for the sake of kicking, which did used to happen. I think you've got to find an happy medium if you can. But it still is a great game. I did become a little bit bitter and twisted with it towards the end. But yeah, as I say, I was very lucky to have a fantastic career, and I got you do have regrets, and there are some regrets, but I can't say that I didn't have a fantastic career at what is a great club. I mean, we have our little disagreements now and again, but who doesn't in a marriage? And the supporters have always been fantastic, and I'm not just saying that. They have been brilliant. They are a different breed here. I know I've not really been at any other club, but other lads that have come from other clubs have said they've been at big clubs as well. They can't, they say they can't understand. They can't believe just how passionate these people are. And I'm talking proper passionate, because they treat their club as part of the family, literally.
You've in your career played at seemingly every away ground. So
I did do. There's all different teams in the leagues now, but yeah, I did. But a lot of those grounds don't exist, and they've all moved to nice, pretty grounds since then.
So what's your favourite away ground or away trip that you used to go to?
I think I always sort of did okay. For some reason, I always used to do all right at Oldham and at Plymouth. I used to seem to have decent games when we used to play there. The easiest one is to say the one that I hated to go to, which I'll come back to Wimbledon, which was Plough Lane, because Noel Blake's back pass, my broken cheekbone there. And I think the fact that was probably the closest ground to where I was born as well, so that was even more annoying, that I would always have a nightmare there. And And they were doing very well at the time, to be honest. They went into the Premiership with Vinny and Fash and Wisey and Dave Besant. And that was always a frustrating thing, because when I was a kid, they were in the Southern League, but they went on and we always used to have a battle against them boys.
And what has been the most bizarre experience you've ever been a part of or seen on a field?
Well, apart from that back pass goal where we ended up 2-0 down without Wimbledon touching the ball, I suppose that would probably be it. There's been some strange things that have gone on, but I think the most bizarre was probably off the pitch at the time, at half time, when we'd come in here at Fratton Park and Alan Ball was manager. And I think we must have been losing. I can't even remember, this is my memory. I can't remember who we were playing, but we come in at half time, door got slams in the dressing room, Baldy started to dig out Kevin Dillon, who was our midfielder at the time, and Kevin was quite a fiery character. So Baldy's gone, that's it, right, you're coming off. And whoever was sub, Vince, you'll get stripped, you're coming on. Kevin Dillon, stripped off his kit, was in the dressing room, stripped his kit off, put his suit on, didn't have a bath, didn't have a shower, put it on, walked out the door, slammed the dressing room door. So Alan Ball then goes, there you go, there's your teammate, couldn't care less about you. Obviously he was swearing a bit, I won't swear. Couldn't care less about you, don't give a monkeys about what's going to happen here, we're losing. He couldn't give a monkeys, he's gone. Next thing, door flies open, Kevin Dillon comes back in. He'd been listening at the door to what Bawley had said, and then them two started fighting. So we tried to pull them apart. The buzzer goes for the start of the second half, so we all have to leave to go out on the pitch, and left them two rolling around on the dressing room floor having a fight. So we started the second half, there was no manager, no Kevin Dillon, and then Bawley come back out, his cap was all sort of ripped and turned, and his ginger mop all over the place. But those are the sort of things you sort of half remember. That was quite bizarre.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
It would be from both Bobby Doyle and Mickey Tate. I was lucky enough to have been called up for England youth, and they were senior pros at the time. And I'd been away on a trip, and I'd come back and I'd got a little bit too big for my boots. And they both pulled me to one side and basically told me, you ain't got anywhere, son. You've only played a couple of Mickey Mouse games for England under 18s. And they said it a little bit differently to that, but they said, you got to screw your life, because you're losing your perspective on things. And they were right, I was getting a bit big for my boots, so they brought me down a peg or two. So their advice basically was keep it real.
And what's something that most people think is true that you don't agree with?
In what way?
In football and in life and in general. What's something that a commonly held belief that you might disagree with?
You
could take a minute and
I think everyone's debunked it anyway. And also the great Bill Shankly, when he said that there's football's a matter of life and death or something or other, and it's more important than that, or something, you come up with that and that. That's the thing. I think everything was focused for me. I was brainwashed, and I think players were in and around that time. I don't think it's quite as bad now, but you were brainwashed in that everything evolved around your football. Football was the most important thing. I've already said it. I wasn't there for my mother through her illness and stuff like that, because I was using football as my focus. It was my everything. And I think you've got to, as I said, you've got to be able to put things into perspective and not get tunnel vision on certain things. You need your own life as well to keep your own sanity, really.
And what do you want your legacy to be in 30 years, 40 years?
Look, I mean, in life we all make mistakes and stuff like that. I would like people to think that I was a okay, decent championship goalkeeper. That I was loyal to. The law bit don't come into it for me because, as I say, I was happy. So that loyalty never was the bit. But being within football, not just Portsmouth Football Club, possibly not outside of football, but within footballing, and when it comes to football, I think that I was trustworthy in football, and I'm loyal to football. Probably too much so early on, but yeah, I don't think I've ever, or I haven't deliberately tried to lie to anyone within football or footballing matters. So I try to tell people as it is, and yeah, I suppose if there's a legacy that people will look and say, well, there's a lot of mistakes I did make along that road, and maybe they can learn from that. And as I say, that's the sort of stuff I try to drum into the youngsters coming through. It's about making sure they have their health and their welfare first and foremost, and their education, because it's difficult when your career does finish, whether that be after, like me, when you're 38 or when you're 18 and you don't get your first pro contract. It's tough to go out into the real world. The real world is not a nice place.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Cheers, Josh. No worries.
All right, thanks.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to it on iTunes, Stitcher, Podcast Addict, Acast, or any podcasting catching app. Want to learn more about the guests and go behind the scenes? Then go to my website, www.footballoutobiographyshow.com, and subscribe to my newsletter. Also, if you like the show, or even if you hated it, leave a comment on either my Twitter page at footballoutobio or my Facebook page, The Football Autobiography Show. I welcome and would appreciate any feedback from you all. Thanks for listening. Take care.